Ethan's seemingly perfect marriage shatters when he discovers his cheating wife Becky has been carrying on an affair with her coworker, Mark. As Ethan digs deeper, he uncovers a web of lies, manipulation, and financial betrayal that leaves him questioning everything about their relationship. Becky's deceit doesn't stop at infidelity. Her schemes to exploit Ethan push the tension to explosive levels, leaving audiences outraged at her actions. With each revelation, the stakes rise, forcing Ethan to confront the devastating truth about his wife and the life he thought he knew. Welcome back to the Cheating Diaries, everyone. Today, we're diving into a story that will leave you questioning trust, loyalty, and whether or not secrets ever truly stay hidden. Before we begin, let me know in the comments. Have you ever had a gut feeling that something wasn't right in your relationship? Hold on to that thought because today's story might just confirm your suspicions. It's 2023 in a small but bustling town called Maplewood, a picturesque place with tree-lined streets, cozy coffee shops, and just enough gossip to keep things interesting. But what happens when that gossip turns into something much darker? Let's find out. Our protagonist is Ethan Grant, a 34-year-old graphic designer who could best be described as the guy everyone leans on but rarely looks at. Twice, Ethan's life is pretty predictable. He works remotely from a small corner in his sunlit living room, spends his evenings perfecting his lasagna recipe, and occasionally loses track of time binge-watching crime documentaries. He's married to Rebecca, or Becky, as everyone calls her Becky, 32, is a nurse with a smile that could light up a room and a knack for remembering everyone's coffee order. The two met 7 years ago at a mutual friend's wedding. Ethan spilled champagne on Becky's dress, and instead of being mad, she laughed. That was it. He knew she was the one. But like every small-town couple, their life wasn't exactly a fairy tale. Ethan's steady but unremarkable graphic design career meant long hours at home, while Becky's nursing shifts left her constantly on the go. Despite this, they seemed happy. At least that's how it looked to their friends and family. It all starts on a Monday evening, the kind of night where the silence feels heavier than usual. Ethan is in the kitchen, slicing zucchini for dinner, when Becky walks in, phone in hand. She's distracted, scrolling through messages with a faint smile on her lips. "Something funny?" Ethan asks casually, though he doesn't look up. "Oh, nothing," Becky replies, slipping her phone into her pocket as she grabs a bottle of wine from the counter. "Just a meme from work." Ethan doesn't think much of it at first. Becky's always been glued to her phone. It's how she keeps up with her chaotic work schedule and her friends. But something about her tone feels off, like she's brushing him off instead of sharing the joke like she usually would. Later that night, as they sit on the couch watching their favorite sitcom, Ethan notices Becky's phone light up with a notification. She quickly flips it over, face down, and gives a tight smile. Ethan doesn't say anything, but the seed of doubt is planted. Over the next few weeks, Ethan starts noticing more little things. Becky's phone is always on silent now, and she's taking her calls in the other room. Her laughter, once easy and frequent, feels guarded. She's also been working more late shifts than usual, or at least, that's what she says. One night, Ethan decides to surprise Becky by stopping by her hospital with her favorite takeout during her break. But when he arrives, the receptionist looks confused. "Rebecca Grant?" the receptionist repeats. "She's not on tonight's schedule." Ethan freezes, clutching the bag of food. "Maybe she switched shifts last minute?" he offers weakly. The receptionist shrugs. "Could be, happens all the time." Ethan leaves the hospital without calling Becky. Something doesn't sit right, but he tells himself he's overthinking it. She's probably helping a coworker or running errands, he reasons. Still, the unease sticks with him. Then there's the matter of Becky's new friend, Mark. Ethan first hears about him casually. Becky mentions him in passing as a coworker who joined her unit a few months ago. "He's hilarious," she says one evening, scrolling through her phone. "He has these awful dad jokes, but you can't help but laugh." Ethan doesn't think much of it until Becky starts talking about Mark more often. It's always something small, a funny story he told at lunch, or how he helped her out during a busy shift. At first, Ethan brushes it off as harmless coworker banter. After all, Becky is naturally friendly. But then, there's the night Becky comes home with a faint whiff of cologne that isn't hers. Ethan notices it immediately, even as she quickly explains that Mark had offered her a ride home because her car battery died. Ethan smiles and nods, but internally, he feels like he's standing on a fault line. He doesn't want to be that husband, the one who's paranoid over nothing, but the more he thinks about it, the harder it is to ignore the growing list of inconsistencies. One Saturday morning, while Becky is at the gym, Ethan decides to do something he's never done before: check her phone. He feels a knot of guilt tighten in his stomach as he unlocks it with the passcode she shared years ago, but his guilt quickly turns into something else when he sees Mark's name at the top of her recent messages. The texts aren't overtly romantic, but they're off-casual jokes, inside references Ethan doesn't understand, and a few messages that feel a little too playful. "Wish you were here to see this. You're too much, LOL." Ethan's stomach sinks further when he sees that most of their conversations have been deleted, leaving only fragments of their exchanges. Why would Becky delete messages if there was nothing to hide? When Becky returns from the gym, Ethan acts like nothing's happened, but the phone goes back into her pocket immediately, and she doesn't bring up Mark at all that day. Ethan starts to feel like a stranger in his own marriage. He loves Becky, he really does. But the trust that once formed the foundation of their relationship is starting to crack, and every time Becky laughs at her phone or mentions Mark's name, those cracks widen just a little more. He doesn't confront her yet, though instead, Ethan begins to quietly observe, taking mental notes of every late shift, every vague excuse, every deleted message. He knows something is going on, he just doesn't know what, and he's not sure he's ready to find out. And that's where we'll pause for now. What do you think is going on? Is Becky hiding something, or is Ethan just being overly suspicious? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. But trust me, this story is only just getting started. Stick around for the next part, where Ethan decides to take matters into his own hands, and things take a dramatic turn. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The cracks in his marriage had gone from barely noticeable to glaringly obvious. Becky's behavior wasn't just odd anymore. It was downright suspicious. And while Ethan wanted to believe the best in her, the late-night calls, the deleted texts, and the growing presence of Mark in their lives were starting to paint a picture he didn't want to see. One evening, Ethan decided to test the waters. As they sat down for dinner, he brought up Becky's new coworker, pretending to be casually interested. "So, how's work going?" he asked, slicing into his lasagna. "That new guy, Mark. He seems to come up a lot. What's he like?" Becky paused mid-bite, her fork hovering in the air. It was a split-second reaction, but Ethan caught it. "Oh, Mark. He's fine, just funny, you know. He keeps the team entertained during those long shifts." Ethan nodded, keeping his tone light. "You seem to spend a lot of time with him." Becky shrugged, her eyes darting to her plate. "We work together. It's not like I have a choice." Her response felt rehearsed, and Ethan's suspicion deepened. He didn't press further, though instead, he decided it was time to take a more active approach. Ethan wasn't proud of what he did next, but he felt like he had no other choice. The following morning, after Becky left for work, he logged into their shared phone account online. It didn't take long to find Mark's number. Becky had been texting him more than anyone else, even Ethan. Scrolling through the call logs, Ethan noticed something even more damning. Becky wasn't just texting Mark during the day. They were having late-night phone calls that sometimes lasted for hours, and on the nights Becky claimed to be working late. There were no calls, but her location history, something Ethan hadn't known their phones automatically tracked, showed she wasn't at the hospital. Instead, she was across town at an address Ethan didn't recognize. Ethan copied the address and stared at it for a long time. His mind raced with possibilities. Was it Mark's house? A hotel? He felt a mix of anger, hurt, and disbelief. He needed answers, but he wasn't ready to confront Becky just yet. If there was one thing Ethan had learned from years of watching crime documentaries, it was that evidence was everything. The next day, Ethan called in sick to work. He parked his car down the street from the mysterious address and waited. It felt ridiculous, like something out of a cheap detective movie, but Ethan was determined to find out the truth. Hours passed, and Ethan was about to give up when he saw a car pull into the driveway. His stomach dropped. It was Becky's car. She stepped out, looking around nervously before heading inside. Moments later, another car pulled up. Ethan recognized Mark immediately from the photos Becky had shown him of her coworkers. He was tall, athletic, and had the kind of confident smile that made people like him instantly. Ethan watched as Mark entered the house, closing the door behind him. Ethan stayed in his car, his mind reeling. He felt like the air had been knocked out of him. This wasn't just a bad feeling anymore. This was proof. That night, Becky came home as if nothing had happened. She kissed Ethan on the cheek, chatted about her shift at work, and even asked if he wanted to watch their favorite show. Ethan played along, but inside, he was boiling with rage. As the days passed, Ethan began to notice even more signs that Becky was living a double life. She started wearing perfume she hadn't worn in years, buying new clothes, and paying more attention to her appearance. Ethan wanted to confront her, but he knew she would deny everything he needed more. One evening, Ethan confided in his best friend Ryan, who lived a few blocks away. Ryan was the kind of guy who could make light of any situation, but even he looked serious as Ethan laid everything out. "Man, that's rough," Ryan said, shaking his head. "But you can't just sit around and let this eat you up. You need to decide what you want to do." "What can I do?" Ethan asked, his voice tinged with defeat. "If I confront her, she'll just lie. If I let it go, I'll never trust her again." Ryan leaned back, crossing his arms. "Well, if it were me, I'd make sure she can't lie her way out of it. Catch her in the act, you know?" Ethan knew Ryan was right. If he wanted closure, he needed to see it for himself. But the thought of what he might find made his stomach churn. The next week, Ethan's opportunity came sooner than he expected. Becky had told him she was working another late shift, and Ethan knew exactly where she'd be. This time, he wasn't going to wait in the car. Ethan parked a few houses down from the address and walked to the house. The lights were on, and through the window, he could see Becky and Mark sitting on the couch. They were laughing, their heads close together. Ethan clenched his fists, feeling a surge of anger and betrayal. He stepped back, his mind racing. Barging in would only cause a scene, and he wasn't sure he was ready for that. Instead, he pulled out his phone and started taking pictures. He hated himself for it, but he knew he needed proof if he ever wanted to move forward. As Ethan walked back to his car, he felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of him was relieved to finally have the truth, but another part of him wished he'd never found out. He knew there was no going back now. Back home, Ethan spent hours staring at the photos on his phone. He thought about the life he and Becky had built together, their wedding, their first apartment, the plans they'd made for the future. It all felt like a lie now. He knew he couldn't keep this to himself any longer. The next morning, Ethan confronted Becky. He laid out everything he'd discovered, the texts, the calls, the photos, and waited for her response. Becky didn't deny it. She sat in silence, tears streaming down her face as Ethan laid bare her betrayal. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to happen." Her words felt like a slap in the face. Ethan had spent weeks doubting himself, wondering if he was overreacting, only to find out he'd been right all along. He felt a surge of anger, but also a deep sadness. Ethan and Becky's conversation stretched late into the night. She apologized repeatedly, but her words felt hollow. Ethan listened, but his mind was already made up. This wasn't something he could forgive, not now, and maybe not ever. The next morning, Becky packed a bag and left. Ethan watched her go, feeling a strange sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe again. Life after Becky wasn't easy, but Ethan took things one day at a time. He leaned on his friends and family, slowly rebuilding his confidence and his sense of self. And while the scars of betrayal didn't fade overnight, Ethan knew he'd come out stronger on the other side. What would you do if you were in Ethan's shoes? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this. Your support means the world, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts on how Ethan handled things. Stay tuned for the next part of the story. It's only going to get more intense from here. Ethan thought life would feel clearer after Becky left instead. It felt like the air in his house had turned stale, as if her betrayal had seeped into the walls and refused to leave. Days turned into weeks, and though he tried to move on, The images of Becky and Mark laughing together haunted him. It wasn't just about the betrayal anymore. It was the realization that the life he thought he had was never really his. One evening, Ethan received an unexpected message from an unfamiliar number. The text read, "I thought you should know the full story. Let's meet. Mark." Ethan's chest tightened as he stared at the screen. Of all people, Mark was the last person he wanted to hear from, but curiosity gnawed at him. What could Mark possibly have to say? After pacing the room for nearly an hour, Ethan replied with a single word. "Where?" The next day, Ethan found himself sitting in the back corner of a coffee shop, his hands clenched around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. Across from him sat Mark, looking far less confident than the man Ethan had seen laughing with Becky. His shoulders slumped, and his hands fidgeted with the edge of his cup. "Thanks for meeting me," Mark began, his voice low. "I know I'm the last person you want to see." "You got that right," Ethan replied, his tone icy. "So why am I here?" Mark took a deep breath, avoiding Ethan's gaze. I needed to come clean about everything. I know I'm not blameless. But there's more to this than you think." Ethan leaned back, crossing his arms. "Enlighten me." Mark explained that what started as harmless flirting had quickly spiraled into something much bigger. Becky, he claimed, had been the one to initiate their affair. "She told me you two were practically strangers," Mark said, "that you'd grown distant and didn't care about her anymore." Ethan's jaw tightened. "And you believed her?" "I was stupid," Mark admitted, shaking his head. "But it wasn't just about the affair, Becky. She's not who you think she is." Mark went on to reveal that Becky had been using him, not just emotionally, but financially. She had convinced him to co-sign a lease on the house where Ethan had caught them, promising they'd move in together after the divorce. But after Ethan confronted her, Becky had ghosted Mark, leaving him to deal with the fallout. Ethan felt a strange mix of emotions as he listened: anger, disbelief, and even a small, vindictive satisfaction. But mostly, he felt tired. Tired of Becky's lies, tired of the web of deception she had spun around him. The meeting with Mark left Ethan with more questions than answers. He decided it was time to dig deeper. If Becky had lied to Mark, who else had she manipulated? Ethan started reconnecting with old friends, piecing together fragments of Becky's life that he had overlooked during their marriage. What he uncovered shocked him. Becky had a history of using people, friends, co-workers, even family members, to climb her way up in life. She'd taken loans she never repaid, friendships she discarded when they were no longer useful, and opportunities she'd seized at the expense of others. It was as if Becky had been wearing a mask their entire relationship, and now Ethan was finally seeing her true face. Ethan's resolve hardened. He wasn't just going to let Becky walk away from the mess she'd created. He decided to reach out to a divorce attorney, determined to ensure that Becky didn't take more than she deserved. His attorney, Claire, was sharp, no nonsense, and immediately understood the gravity of the situation. "We need to gather everything," Claire said during their first meeting. "Financial records, evidence of infidelity, anything that shows the court who Becky really is." Ethan handed over the photos, texts, and call logs he had collected. Claire nodded approvingly. "This will help, but be prepared. This won't be easy. People like Becky know how to twist the narrative." Ethan knew Claire was right. Becky had a way of making herself the victim, of spinning stories that put her in the best light. But Ethan wasn't the same man he had been when this all started. He was ready to fight. The legal battle was brutal. Becky's attorney painted Ethan as an inattentive husband who had driven Becky into Mark's arms. They claimed the financial records were inconclusive and argued that Becky was entitled to half of everything, including the house Ethan had worked so hard to maintain. But Claire was relentless. She presented the evidence of Becky's affair, her financial manipulations, and her pattern of deceit. Witnesses, including Mark, testified about Becky's behavior, painting a picture of someone who had spent years taking advantage of those around her. The courtroom became a battleground, each side fighting to sway the judge's opinion. Ethan felt the weight of every accusation, every piece of evidence, every tearful plea from Becky. But he held his ground, knowing that this fight was about more than just money. It was about reclaiming his life. As the divorce proceedings dragged on, Ethan felt like he was caught in a storm with no end in sight. Each hearing was a battle, and while Claire remained composed and focused, Becky's theatrics kept the courtroom on edge. She cried when it suited her, painted herself as the wronged party, and even tried to downplay her relationship with Mark. But Claire wasn't falling for it. One day, she pulled out a surprise piece of evidence, a recorded voicemail from Becky to Mark, where she explicitly talked about their plans to be together after the divorce was finalized. Becky's face paled as the recording played, and the courtroom fell silent. It was a turning point, a crack in the facade she had so carefully maintained. For the first time, Ethan felt like he might actually win this fight. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, Ethan was dealing with another storm, his own emotions. The betrayal, the lies, and the constant reminders of how easily Becky had deceived him weighed heavily on his mind, but something unexpected began to happen. As Ethan faced these challenges head-on, he started to notice a change in himself. For years, he had lived in the shadow of Becky's larger-than-life personality. He had always been the quiet one, the dependable one, the one who never rocked the boat. But now, he was learning to stand up for himself. He was no longer content to be the passive observer in his own life. And while the pain of Becky's betrayal still lingered, it was slowly being replaced by a sense of purpose. Ethan started reconnecting with old hobbies he'd abandoned during his marriage. He picked up his camera for the first time in years, capturing the world through a lens that felt sharper and more vibrant than ever. He even joined a local hiking group, finding solace in the quiet strength of nature. Slowly, but surely, he was rediscovering the parts of himself that he had forgotten. The next major turning point came when Claire presented Becky's financial records to the court. For years, Ethan had assumed that Becky's spending was under control, but the truth was far more complicated. Claire revealed that Becky had racked up thousands of dollars in credit card debt, most of it spent on luxury items and trips she had never mentioned to Ethan. Worse yet, some of the charges were tied to Mark, expensive dinners, hotel stays, and even gifts. Becky tried to explain it away, claiming the charges were misunderstandings or necessary expenses. But the judge wasn't convinced. The evidence painted a clear picture of someone who had been living beyond her means and using Ethan as a safety net. By the end of that day in court, Ethan felt a small but powerful sense of vindication. For so long, he had doubted himself, wondering if he was imagining things or overreacting. But now, the truth was out in the open, and Becky's lies were unraveling. But just when Ethan thought things couldn't get any more intense, another revelation rocked the case. Mark, who had initially testified against Becky, came forward with new information. Apparently, Becky had approached him with a plan to frame Ethan. She wanted to create a false narrative that Ethan had been abusive and controlling, hoping it would sway the court in her favor. Mark claimed he had refused to go along with it, but the mere suggestion of such a scheme left Ethan reeling. The idea that Becky, the woman he had loved and trusted, could sink so low was almost too much to bear. But instead of breaking him, the revelation steeled his resolve. Ethan wasn't just fighting for a divorce anymore. He was fighting to reclaim his dignity and his future. The final days of the trial were a whirlwind. Claire pulled no punches, laying out the evidence in a way that left no room for doubt. She highlighted Becky's pattern of manipulation, her financial irresponsibility, and her attempts to deceive the court. By the time Claire delivered her closing arguments, the courtroom was silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Becky, for all her theatrics, seemed to sense that the tide had turned against her. Her usual bravado was replaced by a quiet desperation, and even her attorney looked like they were ready to throw in the towel. Ethan, meanwhile, sat tall and steady, a far cry from the man who had once doubted his own instincts. When the judge finally delivered the ruling, it felt like the culmination of everything Ethan had been through. The court awarded Ethan the house, citing his consistent financial contributions and Becky's misuse of funds. Becky was ordered to repay a portion of the debt she had accrued, and while she retained some of her personal belongings, the judgment made it clear that she would not be walking away unscathed. For Ethan, it wasn't just a legal victory, it was a moment of closure. The weight that had been pressing on his chest for months began to lift, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe again. But the story didn't end there. Ethan's journey wasn't just about winning a court case. It was about rebuilding his life. In the weeks that followed the trial, he threw himself into new projects and opportunities. He started volunteering with a local organization that helped people navigate difficult divorces, sharing his story, and offering support to those who felt lost and alone. He also began to nurture new relationships, both with old friends and new connections. While he wasn't ready to jump into another romantic relationship just yet, he found comfort in the kindness and understanding of others. And as he looked ahead to the future, he realized that he was stronger than he had ever been before. The day of the final hearing was here, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Ethan sat at the plaintiff's table, his heart steady, but his mind racing with every possibility. Across the aisle, Becky wore an expression of cool defiance, though her trembling hands betrayed her composure. The stakes were high, and both sides knew this was the moment that would decide everything. Claire leaned over and whispered, "Stay calm, Ethan. We've got this." He nodded, grateful for her confidence. But the truth was, he was less concerned about the verdict and more about the emotional toll this fight had taken. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was the culmination of years of deceit, heartbreak, and self-doubt. As the proceedings began, Becky's attorney attempted to salvage what little ground they had left. They painted a picture of Becky as a misunderstood woman who had been forced into poor decisions by an unfulfilling marriage. They argued that Ethan's quiet demeanor had left her feeling neglected, pushing her toward the companionship she found in Mark. It was a last-ditch effort, but it was clear that even the judge wasn't buying it. Claire stood to deliver her closing arguments, and her words cut through the courtroom like a blade. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and commanding, "this case is not about a misunderstood spouse or a failed marriage. This case is about accountability. It's about a pattern of deceit, manipulation, and financial recklessness that has left my client, Ethan Grant, with no choice but to seek justice." She went on to detail Becky's actions, from the affair with Mark to the mounting debt and the attempted smear campaign against Ethan. Claire's words painted a stark contrast between Ethan's quiet integrity and Becky's calculated dishonesty. By the time she finished, there was no doubt about where the truth lay. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. Ethan was awarded full ownership of the house and the majority of their shared assets. Becky was held responsible for a significant portion of the debt, and her attempts to claim spousal support were denied. As the judge delivered the verdict, Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't just about the material victory. It was about the validation, the acknowledgement that he had been wronged and that justice had been served. Becky's reaction was a mixture of disbelief and fury. She glared at Ethan as they left the courtroom, her once confident demeanor shattered. For a moment, Ethan felt a pang of sadness. This wasn't how he had imagined their story ending, but then he reminded himself that this wasn't his fault. Becky had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. With the legal battle behind him, Ethan turned his focus to rebuilding his life. He started by tackling the house, which had become a symbol of his strength and resilience. Every room held memories of his time with Becky, but instead of dwelling on the past, Ethan chose to reclaim the space. He repainted the walls, replaced old furniture, and even started a small garden in the backyard. It was a cathartic process, one that helped him heal and move forward. Ethan also began to reconnect with the people around him. He joined a local support group for individuals navigating divorce, where he shared his story and found solace in the experiences of others. The group became a lifeline, reminding Ethan that he wasn't alone in his journey. One day, while attending a group meeting, Ethan met someone who would change his life in unexpected ways. Her name was Laura, a single mom who had been through her own messy divorce. Laura was warm, kind, and genuine, in a way that felt refreshing after everything Ethan had been through. They started as friends, bonding over their shared experiences and their determination to build better lives for themselves and their families. Over time, their friendship blossomed into something more. Laura's presence brought light into Ethan's life, helping him rediscover the joy and hope he thought he had lost. She encouraged him to pursue his passions, reminding him that he deserved happiness just as much as anyone else. Meanwhile, Becky's life had taken a downward spiral. Without Ethan's steady support, she struggled to maintain the lifestyle she had grown accustomed to. Her relationship with Mark had fizzled out quickly, leaving her isolated and burdened by debt. Becky's attempts to rebuild her life were met with limited success, as her reputation as a manipulative and dishonest individual followed her wherever she went. Ethan didn't take pleasure in Becky's downfall, but he couldn't deny the sense of closure it brought. For so long, he had felt like the victim of her actions, but now, he saw her for what she truly was, a deeply flawed individual who had let her own selfishness and insecurity destroy everything she had. The story reached its climax one sunny afternoon, when Ethan received an unexpected visitor. Becky showed up on his doorstep, looking nothing like the confident woman she had once been. Her eyes were tired, her clothes were wrinkled, and her voice was hesitant. "Ethan," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I'm the last person you want to see, but I needed to say this." Ethan stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "What do you want, Becky?" She hesitated, her hands fidgeting nervously. "I wanted to apologize. For everything I know, I can't undo what I've done, but I needed you to know that I'm sorry." Ethan listened quietly, his emotions a mix of anger, sadness, and a surprising sense of peace. For years, he had waited for this moment, for Becky to acknowledge the pain she had caused. But now that it was here, he realized that he didn't need her apology to move on. He had already found his own closure. "Thank you for saying that," Ethan replied after a long pause. "I hope you can find a way to fix your life, Becky. But I've moved on, and I think it's time you did too." Becky nodded, tears streaming down her face. She turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing in the doorway, feeling lighter than he had in years. Ethan's story is one of resilience, growth, and the power of reclaiming your life after betrayal. It's a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is always a path forward, a chance to rebuild, to heal, and to find happiness once again. Ethan stood at the threshold of a new chapter in his life, but he wasn't the only one facing a reckoning. While his journey had been one of rediscovery and healing, Becky's life was unraveling rapidly. Her debts were piling up, her social circle had all but vanished, and the facade she had worked so hard to maintain was crumbling under the weight of her own actions. One evening, Ethan received an unexpected email from Mark. The subject line read, "You deserve to know the truth." Curious, but cautious, Ethan opened it. What he found shocked him. A detailed account of Becky's manipulations during their marriage, written with a tone of regret. Mark admitted that he had been complicit in Becky's schemes, but claimed he was unaware of how deep her deception ran until it was too late. "She used both of us, Ethan," the email concluded. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I thought you should have the whole picture." The revelations from Mark added another layer to Ethan's understanding of Becky's character. It was painful to relive the betrayal, but it also reinforced the progress he had made. He forwarded the email to Claire, who responded almost immediately. "This could be helpful if she tries to appeal the court's decision," Claire wrote. "But more importantly, it's a testament to how far you've come. You're no longer at the mercy of her lies." For Ethan, Mark's confession was less about vindication and more about closure. He no longer needed to dwell on the what-ifs or wonder if he could have done something differently. The truth was out, and it was undeniable. Becky's choices had led them here. Meanwhile, Ethan's relationship with Laura was growing stronger. She had become a source of comfort and inspiration, helping him navigate the complexities of his new life. They spent weekends exploring hiking trails, sharing stories about their pasts, and dreaming about the future. For the first time in years, Ethan felt truly seen and appreciated. But even as their bond deepened, Ethan remained cautious. He didn't want to rush into anything, knowing that healing from his past was an ongoing process. Laura understood this, and her patience only deepened Ethan's respect for her. One evening, as they watched the sunset from a hilltop, Laura turned to Ethan and said, "You've come so far, Ethan. I hope you see that." He smiled, the weight of her words sinking in. "I do, and it's because of people like you, reminding me that I'm worth more than the things I've been through." The story's climax came on a rainy afternoon when Ethan received a frantic phone call from an unknown number. It was Becky. Her voice was shaky, almost unrecognizable. Ethan, I need your help, she stammered. Ethan's heart raced. Becky, what's going on? I've lost everything, she admitted, her voice breaking. The debt, the house, my job. I don't know where else to turn. Ethan closed his eyes, torn between compassion and the boundaries he had worked so hard to establish. Becky's plea for help stirred a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a lingering sense of responsibility for someone he had once loved. You made your choices, Becky, he said gently but firmly, and I've spent too long cleaning up your messes. There was a long pause on the line before Becky whispered, I understand, I'm sorry, Ethan. For Ethan, that moment marked the true climax of his journey. It wasn't about revenge or schadenfreude. It was about finally letting go. Becky's apology, while late, was a small acknowledgement of the damage she had caused, and for Ethan, that was enough. In the weeks that followed, Ethan continued to build the life he had envisioned for himself. He expanded his photography hobby into a small business, capturing candid moments for families and couples. His work became a way to celebrate genuine connections and the beauty of authenticity, something he had come to value deeply. Laura remained a steadfast presence in his life, and their relationship grew in ways Ethan hadn't thought possible. She introduced him to her young son, Jake, a bright and curious boy who quickly bonded with Ethan. Watching them interact, Laura felt a sense of hope she hadn't experienced in years. You're really good with him, Laura said one evening, as they watched Jake build a Lego castle. He looks up to you. Ethan smiled, ruffling Jake's hair. He's a great kid, and honestly, he's teaching me as much as I'm teaching him. The final turning point in Ethan's story came during an annual community event, a charity fundraiser hosted by the divorce support group that had become such an integral part of his journey. Ethan had been asked to speak, and though public speaking wasn't his forte, he agreed, knowing how much the group had helped him. Standing on stage, Ethan took a deep breath and looked out at the crowd. A year ago, I thought my life was over, he began. I was lost, hurt, and angry. But what I've learned is that endings can also be beginnings. It's not easy, and it's not quick, but with the right support, you can rebuild, you can find joy again. The audience erupted into applause, and Ethan felt a surge of pride. His story had come full circle, and he was no longer defined by the pain of his past. As Ethan left the event that evening, he looked up at the night sky, the stars shining brighter than they had in a long time. He thought about everything he had been through, the betrayal, the heartbreak, and the long road to healing. And for the first time in years, he felt whole. Ethan had thought that the phone call from Becky would mark the final chapter in their shared story, but life had other plans. Just as he began to feel like his new life was solidifying, a storm of uncertainty loomed on the horizon. Becky's financial collapse had left her scrambling, and her actions in desperation would soon force Ethan to confront the past he was so determined to leave behind. One afternoon, Ethan received a letter in the mail. It was from Becky's lawyer, requesting a meeting to discuss unresolved financial matters. Ethan felt a twinge of frustration. Hadn't the court already settled everything? He called Claire, who sighed as she reviewed the contents of the letter. It looks like she's trying to reopen the case, Claire said. This is a gamble on her part, but we need to take it seriously. I'll file a response, but you'll need to be prepared for another round. Ethan rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of exhaustion creep back in. He had worked so hard to move on, but it seemed Becky wasn't ready to let go. The meeting with Becky's lawyer turned out to be more confrontational than Ethan had anticipated. Becky was present, and though she tried to appear calm and composed, there was an edge to her demeanor that made Ethan wary. Her lawyer argued that new financial evidence had come to light, suggesting Ethan had hidden assets during the original trial. That's ridiculous, Ethan said firmly. I disclosed everything. Claire can confirm that. Claire nodded. We have all the documentation to prove it. This is a baseless claim. Becky avoided Ethan's gaze, but her lawyer pressed on, suggesting that Ethan's recent success with his photography business indicated he had more financial stability than he had let on. It was a flimsy argument, and Claire wasted no time dismantling it. You're grasping at straws, Claire said, her tone sharp. My client has been transparent from the start. and this meeting is nothing more than a thinly veiled attempt to extract more from him. Ethan stayed quiet, his eyes fixed on Becky. He wanted to believe she wasn't behind this, at least, not entirely, but her silence spoke volumes. The tension from the meeting reignited a fire in Ethan, but this time, it wasn't fueled by anger or hurt. It was determination. He realized that Becky's actions, while frustrating, no longer had the power to derail his progress. He leaned on the support of Laura, his friends, and his support group, finding strength in their encouragement. Laura, as always, was a calming presence. "You've come so far, Ethan," she said one evening, as they sat together on the couch. "This is just another hurdle, and I know you can get through it." Her words reminded Ethan of how much he had already overcome. Becky's attempts to drag him back into the chaos of their past only highlighted the distance he had traveled since their split. As the legal process played out, Ethan focused on his photography business, which was thriving. He had recently landed a contract with a local magazine, and his work was gaining recognition for its raw, emotional storytelling. Each photo he captured felt like a piece of himself, an expression of his journey and his resilience. During one of his shoots, Ethan received a call from Claire. "Good news," she said. "The court has dismissed Becky's claims. They saw it for what it was, a baseless attempt to exploit you. It's over, Ethan." Relief washed over him, but it was more than just relief. It was closure. Becky's final attempt to pull him back into her world had failed, and Ethan felt a renewed sense of freedom. He was finally ready to leave the past behind for good. But life had one more surprise in store. A few weeks later, Ethan received an invitation to a community awards ceremony. To his surprise, his support group had nominated him for the Resilience Award, recognizing his journey and his contributions to the group. At first, Ethan hesitated. He wasn't sure he wanted to relive his story in front of a crowd, but Laura encouraged him. "This isn't just about you," she said. "It's about inspiring others. Your story could make a difference." Ethan agreed, and on the night of the ceremony, he found himself standing on stage, accepting the award. As he spoke, he felt a sense of pride and purpose he hadn't felt in years. "I've learned that resilience isn't about being unbreakable," he said. "It's about picking up the pieces and building something new. And sometimes, it's the people around us who remind us that we're not alone." The audience erupted into applause, and Ethan saw Laura and Jake beaming in the crowd. In that moment, he realized that his story wasn't just about surviving, it was about thriving. Ethan's journey had reached its peak, but it wasn't the end. It was a beginning, a chance to live the life he had always deserved. He continued to grow his business, deepen his relationship with Laura, and find joy in the simple moments that made life meaningful. As for Becky, her life remained a cautionary tale. She struggled to rebuild, burdened by the consequences of her actions. Ethan no longer felt anger or pity when he thought of her, only a quiet understanding that some people choose a path that leads to their own downfall. Ethan thought the storm had finally passed. With Becky's claims dismissed by the court and his life moving steadily forward, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. But just when he thought everything was settling, one final twist came hurtling toward him, a confrontation that would test everything he'd learned about resilience, boundaries, and forgiveness. It started with a knock at the door. One quiet Saturday morning, Ethan was in the middle of editing a photo series for a client when the sound startled him. He wasn't expecting anyone. Laura and Jake were out for the day, and he hadn't scheduled any visitors. Curious, he opened the door to find Becky standing there, looking a shadow of her former self. She was drenched from the light rain, her hair disheveled, and her eyes heavy with exhaustion. For a moment, Ethan froze. The person before him barely resembled the confident, calculated woman who had once manipulated her way through life. "Becky," he said, his voice a mix of surprise and caution. "I need to talk to you," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, Ethan." Against his better judgment, Ethan let her in. She sat on the edge of the couch, clutching her hands together, as if trying to hold herself together. Ethan stayed standing, keeping a careful distance as he waited for her to explain why she was here. "I know I have no right to ask for your time," Becky began, her voice trembling. "But I didn't know where else to go." Ethan crossed his arms, his expression guarded. "What do you want, Becky?" She took a deep breath, and then the words spilled out in a rush. "I lost my job, I'm being evicted. I've burned so many bridges, and now I'm—" Her voice broke, and tears filled her eyes. "I'm scared, Ethan. I don't know what to do." Ethan felt a wave of conflicting emotions, sympathy for her obvious distress, anger at her audacity, and a deep sense of relief that her struggles were no longer his burden to bear. He wanted to help, but he knew better than to get pulled back into her chaos. "I'm sorry you're going through this, Becky," Ethan said after a long pause. "But you brought this on yourself. You made choices that hurt a lot of people, including me. I can't fix this for you." Becky nodded, her tears spilling over. I know I've messed up, and I know I've hurt you more than anyone. But I'm trying to be better. I've started therapy, and I'm working on myself, but it's so hard." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. He wanted to believe her, but years of deceit made it difficult to trust anything she said. "Why are you telling me this now? What do you expect me to do?" Becky's voice cracked. "I needed you to know that I'm sorry. For everything, I don't expect you to forgive me, but I couldn't live with myself if I didn't at least try to make things right." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging between them. Ethan felt a strange sense of closure in her apology, but he also knew that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting Becky's actions had left scars, and while he could move forward, he wasn't willing to invite her back into his life. "I hope you find a way to turn things around, Becky," Ethan said finally. "But I can't be part of this anymore. You need to figure this out on your own." Becky nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. She stood, wiping her tears away. "Thank you for listening," she said softly, "and for letting me in. I won't bother you again." Ethan watched as she walked out the door and into the rain. For a long time, he stood there, processing what had just happened. He felt a mixture of sadness and relief, but mostly, he felt free. This time, there were no lingering doubts or unresolved emotions. This time, he was ready to move on. The encounter with Becky served as a final test, and Ethan passed with flying colors. It reaffirmed the boundaries he had worked so hard to establish and reminded him of how far he had come. That evening, when Laura and Jake returned, Ethan hugged them both a little tighter, grateful for the stability and love they brought into his life. Ethan's photography business continued to flourish, and his work gained recognition in the local art community. He was invited to showcase his work at a gallery event, an opportunity that felt like the culmination of all his hard work and growth. Laura and Jake attended the opening with him, their pride evident as they admired his photos on display. "Dad, this one's my favorite," Jake exclaimed, pointing to a candid shot of a father and son fishing by a lake. Ethan smiled, his heart swelling at the way Jake had started calling him Dad. It was a title he hadn't expected to earn, but it was one he cherished deeply. Laura slipped her hand into his. "You've come so far, Ethan," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "I'm so proud of you." Ethan looked around the gallery, taking in the faces of friends, colleagues, and supporters who had helped him on his journey. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. As the night wound down, Ethan stood by one of his photos, a striking image of a lone tree standing tall in the middle of a storm. A man approached, someone Ethan didn't recognize. "This one speaks to me," the man said, gesturing to the photo. "It's powerful, resilient." Ethan smiled. "Thank you. That's what I was going for." The man nodded thoughtfully. "It reminds me that no matter how tough the storm, we can always find a way to stand tall." Ethan watched as the man walked away, his words echoing in his mind. It was a sentiment that perfectly captured his journey. He had weathered the storm, and now he was stronger for it. Ethan stood in his garden, the warm sunlight filtering through the trees, reflecting off the vibrant flowers he had planted over the past year. It was a small space, but it felt like a world of his own, a peaceful, grounded symbol of everything he had built since the storm of his divorce. He thought about how much his life had changed, and how far he had come, not just in rebuilding his external world, but in rediscovering himself. Becky's visit, had been the final piece of the puzzle. Her apology, though late, gave Ethan the closure he didn't know he needed. But what truly defined the end of this chapter wasn't her words. It was his ability to hear them without being drawn back into her orbit. He had learned to set boundaries, to protect his peace, and to prioritize the life he was creating over the one he had left behind. Becky, on the other hand, continued to struggle. Her therapy sessions became a lifeline, and though her progress was slow, she began to take responsibility for her actions. She moved into a small apartment and took on a job that allowed her to make steady repayments on her debts. It wasn't glamorous, but for the first time, Becky was beginning to confront the choices that had led her to this point. Ethan's life, meanwhile, was blossoming. His photography business had grown into a community favorite, and he had started offering workshops for aspiring photographers. His work didn't just capture moments, it told stories of resilience, love, and the beauty of imperfection. One of his most popular series was called The Rebuild, a collection of images depicting people who had overcome adversity to find their footing again. Laura and Jake had become an integral part of his life. Ethan and Laura's relationship deepened into something steady and unwavering, built on mutual respect and understanding. Jake, now fully comfortable calling Ethan Dad, often joined him on photo shoots, even taking a few impressive shots of his own. "Looks like you've got a natural eye for this," Ethan said one day, handing Jake back the camera after reviewing his latest photo. "Maybe I learned from the best," Jake replied with a grin, earning a laugh from both Ethan and Laura. The final moments of Ethan's journey weren't about grand gestures or dramatic revelations. They were about the quiet victories that defined a life well lived. The gallery that had showcased his work invited him back for a solo exhibit, and his friends and family gathered to celebrate the achievement. One photo in particular caught everyone's attention. A black and white image of a man standing at the edge of a cliff, looking out at a sunrise. The caption read, "Every ending is a beginning." "That one's my favorite," Laura whispered to Ethan as they walked through the gallery. "It says everything without saying a word." Ethan smiled, his heart full. "It's how I feel about this whole journey. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it." As the evening wound down, Ethan took a moment to reflect. He thought about the man he had been at the start of this journey, unsure, hurt, and struggling to find his place. And he thought about the man he had become, stronger, more confident, and at peace with himself. His story wasn't just about overcoming betrayal. It was about learning to value himself, to trust his instincts, and to embrace the possibilities of a brighter future. It was about understanding that resilience isn't about avoiding pain. It's about using it to grow. For Becky, the journey was far from over. Her life wasn't what she had envisioned, but for the first time, she was working towards something real. She had started volunteering at a local shelter, helping others who were trying to rebuild their lives. It was a small step, but it was a sign that change was possible. Ethan had no intention of reconnecting with Becky beyond their occasional necessary communications about legal matters, but he wished her well from afar, hoping she could find her own path to healing. The final chapter of Ethan's story ended not with a dramatic flourish, but with a quiet moment of triumph. He stood in his garden one evening, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. As the sun set, Laura and Jake joined him, their laughter filling the air as Jake recounted a funny moment from school. In that moment, Ethan felt a profound sense of gratitude for the lessons he had learned, the love he had found, and the life he was living. The scars of the past were still there, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they were reminders of his strength and resilience, of everything he had overcome to get to where he was. Ethan's story is a testament to the power of growth, the importance of self-worth, and the beauty of starting anew. It reminds us that life isn't about avoiding challenges. It's about how we face them and what we learn along the way. What did you think about Ethan's journey? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like this. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to bring you more incredible recaps. Until next time, take care and remember, every ending is a beginning. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.